Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into, well, the end of the world. Or at least how people have imagined it over the centuries.
Sounds a bit ominous, doesn't it?
Maybe a little, but it's a fascinating topic, really. We've got a whole stack of sources here. Prophecies, religious texts, scientific papers, even some pop culture stuff.
It's amazing how this idea of the apocalypse has captured the human imagination for so long.
Right. I mean, apocalyptic movies are always a hit, right? But it goes way beyond Hollywood. We're talking ancient texts, centuries-old prophecies. It's really incredible.
And it makes you wonder, why are we so drawn to these end-of-the-world scenarios?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it fear? Fascination? Maybe a bit of both?
Probably. I think it taps into some pretty deep-seated anxieties, about the unknown, about our place in the universe.
And those anxieties often seem to manifest in the specific predictions that pop up throughout history. Like, take those London astrologers in 1524.
Oh, yeah. The ones who predicted a massive flood based on planetary alignments.
Exactly. It seems like their prediction was more about the anxieties of their time, with all the disease and uncertainty they were facing.
Definitely. When you look back at historical predictions, they often reflect the fears and concerns of that particular era.
So projecting those immediate fears onto a, cosmic scale.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that sometimes these predictions are more about human psychology than actual events.
Oh, and speaking of human psychology, what about that chicken that supposedly laid prophetic eggs?
You mean Mary Bateman's chicken back in 1806?
Ooh.
That's a classic.
It is, and it reminds us that sometimes these predictions are less about divine revelation and more about, human trickery.
Absolutely. Always got to look at the source, right? And the evidence, or lack thereof.
Good point. Which brings us to perhaps the most famous failed prediction of all time, the year 1000 AD.
Ah, yes. When even the Pope was convinced the world was ending.
Talk about an apocalyptic frenzy, people giving away their possessions, churches overflowing, pilgrimages everywhere.
It's amazing how a prediction, even without any real basis, can grip people's imaginations so strongly.
And of course, let's not forget the Y2K bug, another example of a prediction that sent people into a tailspin.
It seems like every few decades there's a new doomsday prediction making the rounds.
Right. And those more recent ones, like Y2K or the whole Mayan calendar misinterpretation, seem to tap into modern anxieties about technology and the unknown.
Totally. It's like our fears evolve with the times.
So we've talked about how people have been predicting the end of the world for centuries. But what's also fascinating is how differently various cultures and religions have envisioned this end.
Oh, it's a whole spectrum of beliefs, isn't it? Some are pretty dramatic, like the Norse with their epic battle of Ragnarok.
Talk about going out with a bang, Vikings and gods clashing in a final showdown.
Yeah, pretty intense.
Yeah.
And then you've got ideas like the Hindu concept of cyclical destruction and rebirth, which is a very different take.
It's like cosmic recycling, the end of one universe leading to the birth of another.
Quite a contrast, right? From epic battles to cosmic cycles.
What about the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism? How do they generally view the end times?
Well, they each have their own specific beliefs, of course. But there's often this emphasis on judgment, purification, a new divine order being established.
So less about the world simply ending and more about what comes after, right?
Yeah, there's often a sense of accountability, of things being set right in the end.
And that ties back to the original meaning of the word apocalypse, which is about uncovering or revealing.
That's right. It's not just about destruction, but about truth and justice being revealed.
Wow, that adds a whole new layer to it, doesn't it? Okay, so we've talked about ancient prophecies, religious texts, but what about the end of the world from a scientific perspective? That's going to be a whole different ballgame.
Oh, it is. And honestly, some of the scenarios scientists are looking at are, pretty terrifying.
Like what? Give us the rundown.
Well, there's always the asteroid impact threat, like the one that wiped out the dinosaurs.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. I mean, it happened once. It could happen again.
And then there are supervolcanic eruptions. Imagine an eruption so massive it could blanket entire continents in ash.
Yeah, I've heard about those. And of course, there's climate change. That's something we're all grappling with right now.
Definitely one of the most pressing challenges we face as a species. And it's not just about a few degrees of warming. It's about the cascading effects on ecosystems, weather patterns, even our ability to produce food.
It's like a domino effect. And it's hard to predict just how far those dominoes will fall.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the ever-present threat of nuclear war, which is something we can't afford to ignore.
It's scary to think that we hold the power to destroy ourselves so completely.
Absolutely. But amidst all these potential threats, there's also this sense of agency,
Mm.
We're not just passively waiting for the end. We have the ability to understand these risks, to take action, and maybe even to avert some of these disasters.
So, even in the face of potential doom, there's still hope and a call to action. But before we dive into all of that, let's take a quick detour into the world of pop culture. Because, let's face it, Hollywood has a lot to say about how the world might end.
Oh, yeah. Alien invasions, rogue AI, zombies, you name it, they've got a movie about it.
Right. It's like we're obsessed with playing out these worst-case scenarios on the big screen. But is it just entertainment, or is there something more going on there?
I think there's definitely a deeper layer to it. These movies often tap into our anxieties about technology, about lots of control, about the future in general.
So it's like a way of processing those fears, even if it's through explosions and special effects.
Exactly. And sometimes those fictional scenarios can even influence how we perceive real-world threats.
It's like art imitating life, or maybe the other way around.
It's a fascinating dynamic. Okay, so we've touched on ancient prophecies, religious texts, and even Hollywood blockbusters. But now I'm curious, what does the end of the world actually mean?
Right. Are we talking total annihilation, or is there a more nuanced way of looking at it?
All right, so we've talked about how people throughout history have thought about the end of the world. But let's get into what science says about this.
Okay, so we're moving from prophecies and Hollywood to, like, hard science.
Yeah, exactly. What are the actual threats to humanity based on, what we know about the universe and our planet?
So let's hear it.
Well, one that always comes up is a big asteroid impact.
Mm.
Like the one that wiped out the dinosaurs.
Oh, yeah. That's a scary thought. I mean, if it happened once, it can happen again, right?
It definitely could, but space is so huge that the odds of a really big asteroid hitting Earth in our lifetime are pretty slim.
So we don't need to panic just yet.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But even a smaller asteroid, like a few hundred meters across, could do some serious damage if it hit a populated area.
So it's still a risk, but scientists are keeping an eye on things, right?
Oh, yeah. They're constantly monitoring near-Earth objects, and we've got some pretty sophisticated systems to detect potential threats.
Okay, good to know. And technology is getting better all the time, so maybe we could even deflect an asteroid if we had to.
Yeah, that's the hope anyway. But asteroids aren't the only thing we need to worry about.
What else is there?
Well, have you ever heard of supervolcanoes?
Supervolcanoes, those sound terrifying. What are those exactly?
Basically, imagine a volcanic eruption, but like way, way bigger. We're talking eruptions that can cover entire continents in ash.
Wow, and that would block out the sun, right?
Yeah, it could trigger what they call a volcanic winter, and that could mess up agriculture and ecosystems all over the world for years.
That's a pretty grim scenario. Any supervolcanoes in particular that we should be worried about?
The one that gets a lot of attention is the Yellowstone caldera in the U.S.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
It's a huge volcanic system that's had some massive eruptions in the past, so scientists are definitely keeping a close eye on it.
Okay, so we've got asteroids, we've got supervolcanoes. Anything else we should add to our list of worries?
Well, there's one that's been impossible to ignore lately, and that's climate change.
Yeah, that's been all over the news. How serious of a threat is climate change? I mean, could it really lead to the end of the world?
Well, end of the world is a big phrase, but climate change is a huge challenge for humanity. There's no doubt about that.
And the science is pretty clear on this, right?
Yeah, the evidence is overwhelming. Global temperatures are rising, and human activity is the main driver.
Okay, so it's not just about things getting a little warmer. What are the real consequences of this?
For a lot of things, we're talking rising sea levels, more extreme weather events like heat waves, droughts, floods, hurricanes.
And like one thing leads to another, and it's hard to know where it all ends.
Right. And a lot of scientists think that if we don't get climate change under control, it could lead to societal collapse.
What do you mean by societal collapse?
I mean, think about mass migrations, resource wars, huge parts of the planet becoming uninhabitable.
So it's not necessarily a sudden dramatic end, more like a slow unraveling of things.
That's a good way to put it. And that's what makes it so dangerous. It's easy to ignore a problem that unfolds slowly, but the long-term consequences could be devastating.
Okay, so we've got asteroids, supervolcanoes, climate change. Is there anything else on the science doomsday list?
Well, we can't forget about nuclear war. It's a threat that's been hanging over us for decades.
Yeah, it's kind of terrifying to think about the fact that we have the power to destroy ourselves like that.
It really is. Nuclear weapons are incredibly destructive, and the possibility of an accident or a conflict escalating is a scary thought.
Then there are those other scenarios that are maybe a bit more out there, but still scientifically possible, like a black hole passing through our solar system or a gamma ray burst from a distant star.
Yeah, those are some pretty wild possibilities. A rogue black hole could really mess up the orbits of the planets, and a gamma ray burst could basically fry Earth's atmosphere.
So it seems like there's a lot to be concerned about both here on Earth and out in space. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest. Is there anything we can do to prepare for these things?
That's the thing. It's not about giving into fear. It's about understanding the risks and taking action to mitigate them.
So what can we actually do? Give us some practical steps.
Well, with asteroids, for example, early detection is crucial, and we're getting much better at that. We also need to keep developing technologies for deflecting asteroids if we ever need to.
Okay, so it's about being proactive and using our technology wisely. What about supervolcanoes? Any advice there?
With supervolcanoes, it's all about monitoring and early warning systems. We need to be able to spot any signs of trouble well in advance of an eruption, and we also need to have plans in place for evacuation and disaster relief.
Because an eruption like that would have a global impact.
Exactly. And then there's climate change, which is a much more complex problem, but there are things we can do.
Like what?
Well, we need to transition to clean energy sources. We need to figure out how to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we need to adapt to the changes that are already happening.
So it's a combination of individual actions, collective responsibility, and global cooperation.
Exactly. It's a big challenge, but it's not insurmountable. And it's not just about preventing disaster. It's about creating a better future for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about the real scientific threats, but I want to circle back to those pop culture apocalypses for a minute. Are those scenarios totally fictional, or could there be some truth to those fears, like alien invasions or rogue AI?
That's a great question. It takes us into the realm of speculation and what ifs. But even though we haven't found any evidence of aliens or self-aware AI, yet exploring those scenarios can be a useful thought experiment.
So it's less about predicting the future and more about considering the possibilities and the potential consequences of our actions.
Yeah, exactly. Like take the idea of AI becoming super intelligent and turning against us. It's a common theme in science fiction, but it raises some real ethical questions about how we develop and control powerful technologies.
It's like a cautionary tale about the dangers of playing God with technology.
Right. And then there are zombie outbreaks, which are obviously not scientifically plausible, but they can be seen as metaphors for things we do fear, like pandemics or social breakdown.
So even those seemingly outlandish scenarios can reflect some of our deepest anxieties.
Exactly. Pop culture often acts as a mirror, reflecting our hopes and fears, and by exploring those imagined scenarios, we can have some important conversations about the future.
So in a way, those pop culture apocalypses can help us prepare for the real world, even if the threats we face look different from what we see on the big screen.
That's a great point. Ultimately, it's about recognizing that the future is uncertain, but we're not just along for the ride. We have the power to shape our future through the choices we make.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, from real scientific threats to speculative pop culture scenarios. But there's one big question we haven't really tackled. What does the end of the world actually mean?
That is the big question, isn't it? I mean, when we say the end of the world, what are we really talking
Yeah,
about?
is it always about total annihilation, like everything gone, planet destroyed, no more humans?
Not necessarily. I mean, it depends on how you define the end, right?
So there are different ways to think about it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
For some people, the end might mean the literal destruction of the planet, like no more Earth, game over.
Okay, that's one way to look at it.
But for others, it might be more about the collapse of civilization as we know it.
So like society falls apart, governments collapse, technology fails, but maybe some humans still survive.
Right, exactly. It's not about the planet being completely destroyed, but our way of life is gone.
So a very different kind of end.
And for some people, the end might be even more symbolic, like a major shift in consciousness or a transition to a new era.
Oh, interesting. Like how some indigenous cultures see time as cyclical.
Exactly. The end of one cycle is just the beginning of another.
So it's not necessarily about destruction. It's about change, transformation, renewal.
Right. And it's interesting to think about the word apocalypse itself. I mean, in the original Greek, it means uncovering or revealing.
So it's not just about an ending. It's about what comes after, what's revealed, what emerges from the ashes, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that's the key takeaway here.
Which is?
That the end of the world, whether it's literal or metaphorical, doesn't have to be something we fear. It can be something we learn from.
So all these different perspectives on the end times, from ancient prophecies to modern science, can actually teach us something.
Absolutely. They can help us understand ourselves better, our relationship with the planet, the choices we make.
If you had to sum up the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this, what would it be?
I'd say don't let the idea of the end paralyze you with fear. Use it as motivation to live more consciously, to make good choices, and to appreciate what you have.
So it's not about waiting for the world to end, it's about making the most of the time we have.
Exactly. Focus on the present and work towards a better future.
Well said. We've covered a lot in this deep dive, all kinds of end-of-the-world scenarios. But as we wrap up, what was the one thing that stood out to you the most?
For me, it's the realization that even though there are some serious threats out there, we're not powerless. We have the knowledge and the ability to do something about it.
That's a good point. It's a reminder that we have choices we can make a difference.
And for you, what was the most striking takeaway?
I think it was the idea that the end of the world doesn't have to be a purely negative event. It can be about transformation and the emergence of something new.
Yeah, I like that it gives us a sense of hope, even in the face of uncertainty.
Exactly. Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into apocalyptic predictions. Thanks for joining us.
That's been a fascinating journey.
We hope you've enjoyed exploring these thought-provoking ideas with us. And remember, while the future may hold challenges, it also holds possibilities. It's up to all of us to create the world we want to see.